Thank you. It's great to be in historic Excelsior Springs. Love being here and love what I've seen in the town already. It's been 25 years since I was here, and a little bit has changed in that time. And I will say, you have a jewel here in Laura. She has been a faithful participant in Neighboring 101. And in fact, today is the first time we've got to meet face to face. We've spent, we've maybe 100 hours on Zoom together, but have never met face to face. But she has really latched onto this concept of neighboring, and exciting to see what's going on here in Excelsior Springs with that. I do, from time to time, see the Excelsior Citizen. And I saw an article that appeared this week that called me a neighboring guru. So some of you may have shown up just wondering what a guru looks like. And some of you may be thinking, he doesn't look so guru-y to me. We'll decide after this presentation, after our discussion is over, whether I merit that sort of headline or not. But we'll jump right in because I want to make good use of your time. So, if my clicker still works. There it goes. This is me in 7th grade with my first business, mowing lawns in my small hometown of Ash Grove, Missouri. It was population 1,200 back then. It's population 1,200 now. But this reminds me of what neighboring meant to me growing up. Because I mowed my neighbors' yards. I went to school with my neighbors. I went to church with my neighbors. I played wiffle ball on the lot that was vacant near us with my neighbors. Neighbors were an integral part of life. That's what I grew up with. My grandparents lived just a couple of houses down, and so I often tell people that I went to a neighbor's house to eat cookies whenever I was in trouble. And then I mentioned it was my grandparents and that I was there a lot. So, but that's what I think of when I think of neighboring. And I also think about this. This was in my mom's kitchen, something like this. It was a pound cake under glass, and it was there just for the neighbors. My brother and I had strict instructions never to touch it. Because back then, neighbors would actually come by unexpected and unannounced and ring the doorbell, and we would be happy about it. My, how things have changed, right? And Mom would welcome them in, say, have some cake, have some Sanka. Sanka, yeah, there's a few of you that remember. Yeah, that always dates the crowd. And Tang, yeah, that's what the astronauts drank, by golly, that's good stuff. But I think about that, about how we would be excited when the doorbell would ring and there'd be neighbors. But now, as I got married and we had kids and life gets busy and things in my own life changed. And I would say that when the doorbell rang, it was more like this around our house. We were peeking out thinking, is it Girl Scout cookies? We'll open the door. Otherwise, we're not answering the doorbell. And in fact, we drilled this into my kids' heads because sometimes my wife and I would be gone from the house. And so if the doorbell rings, you don't answer it. It's the whole stranger danger thing, right? And so one day, my mom, who's a librarian, retired, messaged me and said, I'm bringing some books by the house. And I said, well, Stacy and I aren't there, but the kids will get the doorbell. And so we texted our kids, because that's what you do to get your kids' attention, and said, when the doorbell rings, please answer it. And so when I got home, my daughter said, good thing you let us know, Dad, or we would not have answered the door. So in that moment, I thought, man, we did a really good job of teaching stranger danger. But then I also realized that we need to have another conversation because my son was 24 and my daughter was 22 at that point, and we should really be past the stranger danger point, don't you think? At that age, we should be okay with opening the door. But really, it's more like that around the house. And really, busyness of life and people came and went around us in our neighborhood. And really, I had a paradigm change. And that's a big part of my story, is to say I haven't always been such a great neighbor. And we had a moment in 2019 in our life when we realized that neighbors had come and gone and moved in and out. And when the new ones moved in, we didn't bother to get to know them. And here we were, and we only knew the name of one of our neighbors. And that was a challenging neighbor relationship because we're a St. Louis Cardinals household and they're avid Chicago Cubs fans. And that it's difficult. It's difficult. We can't talk baseball. And but as new people moved in, we just didn't even get to know them. And we said, this is not the way life should be. And even when we would say that, if someone would have asked me back then, do I love my neighbors, I would have said yes. Because I didn't throw loud parties, and I pick up after my dog on walks, and I took down my Christmas lights before January 1. I mean, all these things that made me a great neighbor. I was obviously loving, but the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is apathy. And I had apathy. We just hadn't even made the time to get to know people around us. So we did the stereotypical thing. We made a plate of chocolate chip cookies to go over and introduce ourselves. And it may not seem like a big deal, but my wife makes really good chocolate chip cookies. And the idea of giving these away was a little hard to swallow, because she didn't make them that often. But that's what we did. And, I have a friend that says, eat crow while it's young and tender. If you're familiar with that phrase of eating crow, admitting to a mistake. And some of these people lived across the street from us 5 years or more, and we barely spoke to them. So the crow wasn't necessarily young and tender, right? But everyone was pretty gracious when we went over and introduced ourselves. And we shared our contact information, and we just said, we want to do a better job as a neighbor. We want to be connected. And that was really how it started in our lives. From not knowing names to being very intentional to learn names and find ways to use those names. And I can tell you that in that process, we saw fruit in our own lives, and we saw fruit in our neighborhood as our neighbors then became engaged and connected with the people next to them, as we saw that spread down the street. And I can think of tangible examples. Like my wife in 2020, March of 2020, when the lockdown happened, that very day in Missouri is when the doctor called her and told her she had cancer. And so it's a memorable day for us. And now she's cancer-free now. She's doing very well. But I can tell you that among those people that we did not know that were our neighbors, there were 2 ladies that were cancer survivors. And as we got to know, as we had gotten to know them, we knew that part of their story. And then my wife has a diagnosis. So who do you think becomes my wife's support group? These 2 ladies that are neighbors. They were the first 2 to arrive at our house when she got home from the hospital from her surgery. So there's that connectivity that just happened over and over that reminded us of the importance of making that connection. If you have to use cookies or whatever skills you might have to reach out and learn those names and start making those connections. And if you're like me, I'm not real good with remembering names. We had to write it down. We used a grid like this that I'd put together, and there's a grid over here on the handout table with some other materials if you want to try and use this yourself or share it with others. But as we'd step over here and meet our neighbors, Steve and Brenda, we would go back to the house and I'd write down Steve and Brenda, right? And to see that on a regular basis on the refrigerator so I could use the names. Because I can tell you, I learned firsthand, there's a big difference between seeing a neighbor out and saying, hey, you, versus, hey, Matt. Huge difference, 180 degrees. One says you care enough to remember their name. The other one says it's just kind of cordial, maybe. But so remembering names is such a key factor. So an extension, and in this growing national movement of neighboring, when we talk about the word neighboring, we say it's the art and skill of building positive relationships with those that live immediately around you. And the reason we use that type of phrase, and the reason we say immediately around you, one of the things that guards against is if we say everybody in town is my neighbor, we tend to pick people that look like us and sound like us and have the same interest as we do. Remember, I mentioned one of my neighbors is a Chicago Cubs fan. When we pick our neighbors like that, we pick people that we like, oftentimes. So we can pick our friends, but we can't pick our neighbors. And so you start with those immediate 8 around you. Neighbors can grow to be more, but it should never be less than those immediate 8 around you. That's like the starting point. And we found as we got to know our neighbors that, they weren't so much like us. We didn't know that because we hadn't had much engagement. They kind of looked like us, but they had different ideas and different thoughts and different interests. And it turned out to be a blessing, actually. And just a little small side note, one of our neighbors who, when we delivered the cookies, she barely cracked her door. We handed it to her and she said, "What do I owe you for this?" I said, "Well, you don't owe us anything. We're just wanting to make a connection." And as I kept trying to build that connection and visit with her and eventually got to go inside her house, discovered she only had one working toilet, the stove didn't work, and she was a hoarder. And I never would have imagined that from the outside of the house. Her kids didn't live in the area. And so anyway, we were able to call her kids and work with them and help in that situation. That wasn't really the kind of activity I was necessarily looking to have, right? But it was an opportunity to bless someone else and be a help. So it ended up being a very, very good thing. But that's what I mean. You don't, just from observation, you don't always know about your neighbors. But for us, that has been a great experience to build those connections. So let's talk a little bit about neighboring in the United States and some of the aspects of that. I won't bore you with too many statistics, just a few of my favorites. And one of these, this deals with social media and the impact on our lives and really how it has changed our relationships over the years. This is a long-time linear study that's been done where they talk to high school students and they ask them questions, about 3 questions, if this applies to them. I can't do anything right. My life is not useful. I don't enjoy life. If they've ever felt like that, if they've ever said that about themselves. And you can see in 2023 where these numbers are at. You got 49% of high school students saying, I can't do anything right about themselves. And you see this tremendous increase in that line, which is the advent of the iPhone and social media explosion. And so that's one example of the negative impact that has on our own psyche and our own relationships. We have envy for others, and it affects how we view ourselves as well. Another interesting study that's a linear study over time is this decline in trust for our neighbors in America. I don't know what the color codes look like in the back of the room, but here, at least in Missouri, in 1972, 60% of Missourians were saying they trust their neighbors. Now that's down in the area of 20% trust in 2022. We don't trust what we don't know, and we increasingly do not know our neighbors. And if we don't have trust, we make lots of assumptions about them. I'll tell you a little more about that in just a second. And this study actually came out in July of this year. It looked specifically at Gen X, but it monitored or gauged all age groups. Have you ever done something purposefully to avoid a neighbor? And how often do you do things to avoid your neighbors? Things like ducking into your garage, pretending to be on your phone, things in order to not have interaction with your neighbors. And that younger age group, 75% of them said, oh yeah, I've done that. I've done things to hide from my neighbors, which is also an indication of that lack of trust, lack of relationship. And when we get into this trust and fear cycle, what it's called, it's sometimes a spiral that kind of perpetuates itself. And when we don't have trust for others, we make assumptions about their beliefs and their goals, and we're less likely to serve with them on goals. We're less likely to talk about politics and local government and things. Laura and I were talking this afternoon, just remembering our own parents being able to talk with neighbors that had opposite political ideas and then still be friends. How that's kind of gone away, but it's gone away gradually over time as we've seen a diminishing level of trust because we don't know and interact with each other. You know, we had a election in fall, and it was right at the end of October in my neighborhood. There's a few men. We've made a habit over the years of going to the widow's home in our neighborhood and changing the batteries in their smoke detectors. And we give them a couple of weeks to call. We set up times, and we partner up and go and do that. And you hear all sorts of stories when you're changing someone's batteries in their house. And sometimes you have other opportunities to help them as well. But the gentleman was with me that was carrying the ladder. I was carrying the batteries, and a pretty good trade-off. And there's a fairly new lady that had moved into our neighborhood, and her yard was filled with campaign signs. I mean, filled with campaign. This is what this picture reminded me of. And the guy carrying the ladder stopped and said, hang on, I didn't know we were going to this house. I'm like, Shane, I think it'll be okay, buddy. And he goes, are you sure? I'm like, yes, I'm sure. And so we went inside, and she followed us all around the house. She had a disabled son that she cared for. I had not met him before. I didn't know that. We talked sports, or he talked sports to us mainly, but we worked, and she was telling us about how she had some other projects around the house that she needed help with, that she didn't know how she could get them done or who to contact to help. And so we had a nice conversation. By the time we left the house, my friend Shane, carrying the ladder, said, "Do you have her contact information?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I'd like to call her back and come and do those other jobs for her." And I can assure you, they were going to cancel out each other's vote at the ballot box. But when he made a connection and a relationship, able to see past that and work past that. He actually told me the other day that she'd hired him to replace a window in her house as well for her. He'd done some other stuff for her. So, but it's getting to know the person, right, beyond the sign. And it reminds me of one of my own neighbor relationships. I asked AI to come up with this picture for me. I gave the specifics about height and weight and age of my neighbor, and it's remarkably close to my neighbor. It's really pretty interesting because I didn't want to use his actual picture, although I do have one of him when he was much younger. But there's a gentleman in our neighborhood down the street that he's about 6'5", 300 pounds. He's a giant of a man. I hadn't spoken to him in 18 years. I had never spoken to him in our neighborhood because he always looked like he was angry when he was out in the yard mowing. I mean, he just looked grumpy, and he's big, and he was intimidating. And over time, maybe you don't do this, but at least I do. Over time, you kind of start making up the story in your mind about what they must be and who they might be. And after 18 years, we were pretty sure he was a serial killer. I mean, that's just kind of the narrative we had in our head because he's so big and intimidating. And he did one Saturday yell at my wife, who was out walking our dog, who dared to pee on the telephone pole in his yard. He's very particular about his yard. And, she came back crying, and immediately I thought, man, I'm going to go down and have a talk with him. And then I remembered he's 6'5", 300 pounds. And my wife reminded me that we were going to try and get to know our neighbors. So I thought maybe there's a better approach to this. And so I did make contact and say, "Can I come down Saturday and have coffee?" And I wasn't going to ask him about, why he yelled at my 10-pound dog or anything like that. Just trying to get to know him, to listen. Because I just realized we didn't know anything about him. And so there on the driveway where we started the conversation, and eventually to the garage and the kitchen and to his office. But it was kind of like visiting with Forrest Gump. This guy was drafted by the New York Yankees to minor league baseball, where he was there for 2 months, and then Uncle Sam drafted him to Vietnam. He did 4 tours of duty in Vietnam. He's had 17 surgeries as a result of that service. He got shot out of a helicopter with a big machine gun strapped around him. That's him on the left when he was younger, at that age. And I still remember, because it kind of hits me every time I think about it, going into his office and him showing me around and then seeing on the wall 4 Purple Hearts. I thought if you earned a Purple Heart, you weren't going back. Maybe you shouldn't. I don't know. But he had 4. He was wounded 4 different times and kept going back. 4 Purple Hearts. And so as he told me his story, and he told me he had PTSD and he hurt all the time. And I'm just hearing these things and I'm realizing now I understand why he looks grumpy all the time. He doesn't sleep well. His yard was his pride and joy, which is why I yelled at my dog, for messing in his yard. And so I understand. I had a greater appreciation for him, and we found ways to be able to connect. I come to find out that most of the people in the neighborhood had never talked to him. Everybody was intimidated by him. And that spring, we invited some neighbors to his yard, and he did a lawn care seminar for neighbors. It's like one of the few times I've ever seen him smile. He was so happy to get to do that. And people have made connections with him and stuff. And about 2 years ago, AT&T was doing some work along a utility line, and they had to do some digging in his yard. And they started, and he said he didn't know about that. They had not asked his permission. And he went out and yelled at him and ran him off, told him to go get a ladder and come back. But he was telling me this, and he always has a conceal and carry on him. And he said, but I just want you to know I was thinking about you that whole time, which is why I didn't shoot them. And why I told them to go get a letter and come back, because I wanted to be a good neighbor. I thought, well, maybe we're making progress. See? Neighboring saves lives. But you don't know if you don't talk to your neighbors and you don't know them. And so I certainly learned that firsthand from EQ. But there's a lot of reasons that we don't neighbor. The science and research in America says these are kind of the main categories for that. Loneliness, you probably hear about the epidemic of loneliness, but if you are lonely, you're less likely to reach out and make connections. There's also this idea of retreat, that our house is a fortress of solitude, which is great for Superman, but not so good for us. We're kind of created to have that social interaction and connection. Entertainment, we don't have to go to the movie theater or go out. We have all the entertainment right there in the house, right? The big screen TV and so forth. So these are things that keep us locked inside. Busyness, especially with families that have both parents working, but we hear that all the time. This is why we don't have connections, because of busyness. Fear and shame. Fear of what we might find across the street. Shame about what people might find in our own households, are things that keep people locked and not making those connections. And then selfishness. Just, it's my time, it's me time. I don't want to make the time for others. That's a part of it as well. But we do know from that same sort of science and research that when you have neighboring trust, it creates a perceived safety and it decreases our level of stress. Not only do you end up with neighborhoods that are safer and more connected, you end up with a whole lot of health benefits as well. Not to mention undoing the loneliness aspect. When you feel safety, it reduces stress in your life. So it's an important thing for us to pursue for our own health benefits, but there seems to be a tug against us to not do that and think, what is that tug about? That tug is culture. And that culture tug shows up in the research that's available. In the 1950s, there was a series of studies done about neighborhood relationships. And people responded to those studies showing that the connection with neighbors was social connection. 48% of Americans said they socialized with their neighbors once a week. Socialized. And people said a good neighbor is someone that has us over for dinner, someone that plays cards with us, someone that watches my kids, watches my home, cooks dinner for us. It was all this social interaction. That same study was repeated a couple of times through the 70s. We saw those numbers decline. And then in 2022 and 2024, I did throughout the state of Missouri something called the State of Neighboring. You can find a draft copy of that research study there at the end if you'd like to take with you. It's still being peer-reviewed before it's final. But one of the most interesting things in that study, I think, is we asked people to pick traits that make someone a good neighbor. There were 30 traits they could pick from, and both years the top 2 traits that made the list, I know you're dying to know this, you're on pins and needles, what do I need to do to be a good neighbor? Missourians say you need to be quiet and respect my privacy. In other words, you need to be quiet and leave me alone. That's what makes someone a good neighbor. And that's the cultural tug we feel, like when we try to make those connections, when we're trying to swim upstream against the current of the culture, we're swimming against that, this idea of quiet and respect my privacy. So that's what we're pushing against with this Engaged Neighbor program, this idea that we do need to have engagement and connection. It doesn't mean that I camp out on my neighbor's front porch and when they get home from work say, oh, I'm so glad you're home. I've been waiting for you all day. What are we going to do together? I don't do that. But you can't be intentional and have conversations at the mailbox or take the plugs out of your ears when you're walking your dog to say, I'm available. I can have a conversation. Let's talk. Those snippets, those moments, invite them into your life. In that State of Neighboring study, we see there is this evolving definition of what it means to be a good neighbor. Quiet and respect my privacy. We see a definite decline in social interactions. Definite decline. And a definite decline in the number of people who know their neighbors' names. It's very evident in the study. Mostly social level interaction. People do say that trust and support are valued. They still like the idea of being welcomed into a neighborhood. They still like the idea of having a connection with a neighbor. They just don't actually do those things themselves. But people say they still value that. And interestingly, there are some interesting differences between genders. Women are more likely to prioritize privacy. They are more likely to have conversations with neighbors. Men are more likely to do a project or do something to help. And they aren't interested in book studies. They would rather do things shoulder to shoulder with other neighbors to get to know them. I thought those were some interesting differences and takeaways. So we do see this. There's also a decline in the intermediate institutions, things like Rotary clubs, active neighborhood associations. We do see a decline. So Excelsior Springs is really to be celebrated by launching into this engaged neighbor connection, a neighbor engagement team. How valuable that is. You'll see benefits of that for years to come in pursuing that sort of connectivity. The technology has certainly altered social connections. We see that. It's more of what we call weak ties. A weak tie is a wave at a neighbor. A strong tie is knowing their name and knowing what they do and maybe inviting them over to do something. That would be a strong tie. A weak tie is just a wave. And certainly a change in our social capital. One of the great ways I heard social capital described, have you played the game 7 Degrees of Separation? You know, there used to be like 7 steps to Kevin Bacon, I think, right? With actors and actresses. And you can play that same thing. There's been some famous studies just among regular humans, not actors and actresses. But it's usually about 6 degrees of separation. But your really tight connections, your social capital, is usually within 3 degrees of separation. So it's who you know and who they know. That's all of your social capital. And that adds up in the community into so many important ways. So the easy steps in building social capital and building neighborhoods really are these kind of 4 steps. Learn the names of your neighbors, find opportunities to use their names, then host some fun gatherings. It does not have to be a block party with a bounce house and a clown and a magician. You don't have to do that. It's not about entertainment, it's about connection. In our neighborhood, we just did what we called monthly driveway chats. Bring your own beverage and bring a lawn chair. We just designated what driveways we were going to be on. The first one, when we first started that, we had six neighbors, and last year in the fall, the last one had 72 neighbors. So, and it's just to come and talk with your neighbors, to get acquainted. So there can be simple things. You may determine what builds on the assets in your neighborhood and what can be the most fun thing to do. Maybe it is Flamingo Fridays, right? Or other things to get people connected. But those are ways to find those opportunities. And then, doing a club, if it's a neighborhood engagement team or it's a neighborhood association, it's a Rotary club perhaps, starting that. These are ways that we build that trust and connection with people. So we sometimes talk about neighboring and say it's like a crock pot. The key to this crock pot is low and slow. It cooks for a long period of time, right, at a slow heat. In fact, my wife has a great recipe for garlic pot roast. It's a family favorite around our house. When my daughter was 8, she picked this for her birthday meal. I knew that I loved my daughter when she picked garlic pot roast for her birthday meal. But the key to it is this right down here, man. It's got to cook 7 to 8 hours, low and slow. And it turns out that's exactly the way relationships are. That's exactly the way neighbor relationships are and friendship is. This is a fairly famous study. Part of me hates to attribute it because it's a professor at the University of Kansas, which is really hard for someone that works for the University of Missouri to say. But it's really the best one that was done. And he really looks at all different demographics and what it is that helps build those friendship connections. And the secret ingredient? Time. Time. And it's not quality time. It's not even what you do during that time. You can play video games together, go on hikes together, bike together, sit on the driveway and chat together. It didn't matter what. The element was time. So 50 hours to become like casual friends, 90 hours to be a friend status, 200 hours to be a close friend. mean, it takes a lot of time. So when you're thinking about this in terms of neighboring, none of my neighbors, when I rang doorbell and I said, here's my contact information, no one texted me back the next day and said, you're my best friend. Surprisingly. Shock. It took time. It took events. It took activities. It took opportunities, inviting them to go to things. It took time. Some came about quicker than others. One of my neighbors took almost 2 years because we would have little get-togethers. He never came. We always invited Rick. He never came. Finally, he came. I know I had a look of shock on my face. And afterwards I said, Rick, it was so great you came. Why'd you come today? And he said, well, I've been watching you guys, and it's starting to look like you're having fun. It took him 2 years to get to that point, right? But you have to invest time. That's crockpot neighboring. It just takes time. And so there are something that I have that's called the Engaged Neighbor Principles. You can find it. There's some addresses in some of these publications over here. The website, I think, is called No More Good Neighbors. It's building on this idea of the steps to take to be an engaged neighbor, those principles. And REACH is our acronym. It's really about relationship, empathy, action, courage, and humility. And I won't go through all of those. Each of those have 4 principles under them, 4 examples that apply in that category that help us build neighborhoods and neighborhood relationships. You can take the pledge online if you want to look at that. Take the pledge, add your name and your email address, and then we do some things online through Zoom that are only for the people that have taken the Engaged Neighbor Pledge. We've got about 300 people that have so far. But one of the principles out of that is invite your neighbors into your routine. So you don't have to do, a big old event with a blow-up house and a magician or anything like that. Invite your neighbors into your routine, things that you're already doing. There's a basketball tournament in Springfield called the Tournament of Champions. It's the largest high school basketball tournament in the nation. They bring in the number 1 high school team, these big teams from around the country to play local teams. I've gone to that tournament for years by myself. I love basketball. And then suddenly I thought of this moment. I thought, I'm trying to get to know my neighbors. Maybe some of my guy neighbors would want to go with me, right? So I didn't come up with something new. I just involved them in something I was already doing. And we spent the whole day watching basketball. My wife, when we got home, she said, well, what'd you learn? Did you learn anything from the neighbors? I'm like, no, we watched basketball together. We had a great time, guys, shoulder to shoulder, right? We didn't have to talk as much, but just inviting them into my routine. Getting to know your neighbors and their talents and their assets. This is one of my neighbors, Willie Lyles. Willie is a retired conservation agent with a big boat set in his driveway. I did not know Willie until, we made the connection with the cards. We started having conversation that he is the national champion gourd painter. Did you know there's a national gourd painting association? I didn't know that either. And they have a national show every year. And he is the 2-time national champion. These are gourds that he grows and then he paints into creations. So if you're going to do an art project in the neighborhood, invite Willie to help with the art part of that. I had no idea. And I also didn't know until this summer that Noah Lyles, who won the gold medal in the 100 meters, is his cousin. He'd been holding out on us. He'd never told us that. I've also discovered that this idea of connecting through activities or an act of kindness for a neighbor, we overthink that a lot because the bar is set so low. It's hard to step over it. It's hard to get under it even. So an example. I had some neighbors that moved in down the street. They were older. The husband was getting a knee surgery. And they mentioned he was going to be out of commission. And the following week, we had a snowstorm. Now, I live down in the Ozarks. A snowstorm was like 3 inches. And we were all panicked over that. So, and I went down to shovel their driveway. And it's a very short driveway. So it's not be overly dramatic about this. Short driveway, short sidewalk. But I went down to shovel and clear it off. And I turned around, and I'd only had this one conversation with them when they moved in. And there was Linda on the porch with a cup of hot chocolate. This is my love language. And I went over to receive this, and she said, we've lived in 14 different places This is our retirement home. Thank you for doing this. You are the best neighbor we've ever had. Well, the zipper on my Carhartt's just about burst. I thought, best neighbor ever. That's pretty awesome, And I'm walking home with a shovel over my shoulder and a spring in my step. And halfway home, I realized, hang on, that's only the second conversation I've ever had with her. And the first time I've ever done anything for her. And that qualifies me as the best neighbor ever. That was a reminder to me, and I've had many since, that the bar is set really low. Simple acts of kindness go a long way because they are countercultural. People are not used to those anymore. So simple acts of kindness. And then if you're going to have a get-together, do something you love. I mentioned this to Laura this afternoon we were talking. My wife loves coffee. I can't stand it. But my wife loves coffee. She loves to talk about coffee. She loves to have coffee. She loves to share coffee. All that you can think about. So once a quarter, we have coffee in the driveway. We have a little Keurig. It is nothing fancy. Nothing fancy. We use a Keurig. We make everybody a cup of coffee. Last time we did one in February, you had 42 neighbors come by for a cup of bad coffee. Right? And some stay and visit. Some just get a cup and visit for a little bit and go on. But it is a social connection that we're able to do. And it's nothing fancy to set up for. And a few chairs, some of them bring their own chairs and stuff, but it's something easy to do. Because once I got past that mindset, it's not about the entertainment, it's about the connection. It opened up all sorts of opportunities for us. And don't overlook people in your neighborhood who are marginalized or easy to overlook. We did in our neighborhood a turquoise table grant. There's a book called The Turquoise Table. It's meant to be a gathering spot. And we were going to do some in some yards. You had to keep it kind of in your front yard, allow it to be a gathering spot, use it as a place to gather with neighbors was the idea. And the one string attached was we were going to have a table delivered, and you had to set up a time with me for me to come and paint the table with you. That was the catch. You were going to have to endure me for an hour of painting on this turquoise table. So Peter Chen and his wife Melanie, they are first generation Americans from China. And so they got one of the turquoise tables. And we were painting on this table, and that's when Peter said, I'm afraid that I'm becoming too Americanized. I thought this was an interesting comment to make. I said, tell me more about this, Peter. And he said, well, this week I went to Lowe's and bought a tool before I asked my neighbors to borrow one. He said, in China, you would always ask to borrow before you go buy something. He goes, and it didn't cross my mind. I'm becoming too Americanized. And I thought, that's a good lesson. Because we're quick to go buy things, aren't we? And when you ask to borrow, there's a reciprocal aspect to this. There's also a relationship aspect to this. That was a good lesson for me to come out of that. So a few other things as we get close to winding down. One of the activities that you can participate in as a city, and as Excelsior Springs has done, in fact, Excelsior Springs, one of the most neighborly cities in Missouri last year, through what was done with the Good Neighboring Week. You can participate as an individual, report your active neighboring. There's a lot of city engagement to participate in. That's something that we got the governor to pass back in 2022 and have been promoting statewide and growing. So love to see your involvement with that. Show Me Neighborhood Art Week is June 1 to 15th. You can register public art like in your yard or doing something with your neighbors. I involve my neighbors in a art project we do together each year and display. As it's meant to emphasize public art, and art helps create a sense of belonging for people, and it's an important part of placemaking and connection. We do barn quilts with neighbors, and I get the boards and we mark them off and paint them together and then display them. We do more than just the 2 weeks. We display it all summer long, but that's the goal, to get it up by that time. There's also something, Neighborhood Leadership Academy, that's worth looking into. You have a graduate of Neighborhood Leadership Academy right here in this room, Laura Mize. It's a 10-week course. I'm sure she can fill you in on it. There's a brochure over here. At the end, graduates have a chance to write for a grant that can help fund a local project in their neighborhood. And then there's a national organization, Neighborhoods USA. One of the great things that they do at this conference is neighborhood awards, neighborhood recognition. And I like to mention that because you have a lot of really neat things going on in Excelsior Springs, and I think you're going to have some great opportunities to vie for some national awards in the future. So putting that on your radar. Neighboring 101 is something we do each month online. You can find that on the Extension website. Tim Jones is our host or our guest in April about community table events, staying across from people over food and building connections that way. But I have authors from all over, Seth Kaplan and Dave Runyon, Marja Carter, Mike Mather, Melanie Warner, authors and others working in the neighboring space. And this really is a growing national movement. It's not just Missouri, but it's certainly popping up all across the nation, the neighboring movement. So to kind of wrap up this idea of social fitness and civic muscle, this is me and my dog, Otis, on a walk. And my wife encourages me to walk for physical fitness. And we talk a lot about physical fitness in the nation. We don't talk so much about social fitness. And that idea of the disconnection, of wanting neighbors to be quiet and leave us alone, is an indicator of our fallen social fitness. I think we need to be talking more about that. Overcoming loneliness, the importance of making these connections. So while we encourage people to get out and walk, we might also encourage people to do more driveway chats, do more block party get-togethers, more coffees. And there's some tools that you can use to look at that. The Hopeful Neighborhood Project has a process they go through where you can gather your neighbors together and you look at what are the gifts and assets that are unique in your neighborhood to build something around those unique gifts and talents that's specific to your area. Like my wife's love of coffee. But you may have a neighbor who's a great guitarist and they like to do music on the porch, something like that. What are the gifts? Imagining the possibilities, the way you can work together with your neighbors, and then coming up with a plan, saying this is how we're going to try and implement this. Pursue it for the common good. Gathering your neighbors to focus around these gifts and assets instead of gathering around a problem. Instead of gathering around a negative issue that will get people riled up for a while, but then dissipates. Gathering around gifts is a much more positive, long-term, sustainable way to develop your neighborhood and your community. That's what we try to encourage. And again, this idea of social fitness. That's part and parcel of this, the gathering, the connection. So to wrap up, this is a famous painting by a Frenchman named Georges Seurat. It was painted in 1897, I believe. And this was the first time ever that a painter did not use brush strokes to make the painting. He used very small dots. And why this reminds me of community is over the years I have oftentimes said, me as an individual, I can't do anything that's going to change Washington, D.C. I probably can't do anything that's going to change Jefferson City, but I can do something every single day that impacts my neighbors and my neighborhood. That's within my sphere of influence. From sun up to sundown, I can do something that's positive in my neighborhood. And that kind of reminds me of this picture. I mean, it's a great picture when you're looking out, but when you zoom in, right, maybe I'm this dot right here. When it comes to Missouri or even Excelsior Springs, where's your dot? You have the responsibility for making that dot the best possible dot you can. That's your role. That's your sphere of influence. That's what you can contribute to the larger picture. And when we all do that, we end up with a beautiful picture to end up with. But it all begins by doing the very best at painting your dot.